Hi and good evening. It is the first night of Hanukkah of 2019 or 5780 in the Jewish calendar. And as has been my tradition for these past few years, going off of the short story advent calendar that Canadian booktubers bring out, I am reading from a Jewish short story collection and talking about one story per night. So this year I am reading from this recently translated collection, Oedipus in Brooklyn and Other Stories by Loom Lempel, translated from Yiddish by Ellen Cassidy and Yemiyahu Aharon Traub. And unlike in some other years, I'm going to try to read 2 or 3 stories per night and then choose one of them to talk about here. So the first story I'm going to talk about is Neighbors Over the Fence. Like the other 2 stories I read tonight, it heavily relies on talking about the Holocaust, but it does it from a slightly different bent. And it's about these 2 neighbors who maintain a relationship over the fences of their yards. They live in this neighborhood in America, and the 2 neighbors are Betty, who is a Jewish woman, and Mrs. Zapparelli, an Italian-American woman. So already that's both sides of my heritage there. Mrs. Zapparelli at first was kind of cold toward Betty because it used to be an Italian family who lived in her home, but then she realized that Betty was a gardener, and they started to have a relationship just outside of their homes where Mrs. Zapparelli would help Betty with her gardening, and she would unleash her woes a little bit about her son and her daughter-in-law who just weren't as interested in this sort of thing and what have you. And then the crux of the story takes place one day where Mrs. Zapparelli is in a bit of a state and does something unusual. She actually comes to Betty's door and sits in her house, and she tells this story about a fly who died and how it's distressed her to lose this fly. And the way that she tells it, well, it relates to the Holocaust. The specific story of this fly is that it was kind of born too early, and all of its people died. Its fly family basically died, and it's living out its life alone and in anguish, and that's how Mrs. Zapparelli characterizes the situation. And Betty, who, if she's like the rest of Lempel's narrators, might be a Holocaust survivor. She's, of course, thinking of the Holocaust and thinking of survivors and thinking of how so much of the Jewish race in Europe was just extinguished, on purpose, she uses a phrase of cold, calculated, brutal murder, So, yeah, it's almost like she's trying to explain the Holocaust for a broader audience here. And I thought it was effective. And so too was all of the beautiful language in this story about gardening. So there's that too. Good evening. It is the second night of Hanukkah, and I have a card that came in the mail from my parents. I've read a few more stories in this collection, and tonight I think I'm going to talk about the titular story, Oedipus in Brooklyn. This is a retelling of the myth of sorts, and it deals with some of Lempel's more controversial, I suppose, subject matters, which, if you know the myth, probably not surprising to say that there's some incest in here, except in this case, actually, the boy loses his sight before he goes after his mother. The background is that this... it's a young family, and the father and the son go on a vehicle, a road trip, and there's a horrible accident. The father dies, the son loses his sight, and then he and the mother are basically outcast. She's sort of left adrift in her grief, and she kind of gets herself out of it enough just to sort of take care of him. Then they end up, they start in Brooklyn, and then they end up leaving for Florida, where they feel like maybe it'll be a better environment for him, but they stay relatively isolated even as he grows into a teenager. He's very against the idea of her having a life without him, so they kind of start embarking on an affair, basically, that he starts. and gets to the point where she's pregnant. And I guess I shouldn't spoil everything, although, again, if you know the myth, it's kind of as dark as the myth. I don't know if I should say it's her darkest, because a lot of her stories have to do with the Holocaust, so there's, dead people all around. This one doesn't have to do with that. These characters are Jewish, but, kind of just know that through some allusions to the Bible or the Good Book, and, saying we had Jewish modesty before this happened. I'm starting to realize I think Lempel doesn't do a lot with character development, which for me is a big selling part into stories. I like knowing about character development, especially when it comes to taboo subjects. I don't want to immediately go, and, shut the door on it, but I want to know why characters act the way they do, and like if I believe it kind of stuff. And that's not how this really goes. She has a really lyrical style, kind of like, almost like, someone's telling you a tale. And there's a lot of beautiful description of physical descriptions and even emotional, but it's like, describing emotion rather than sort of, having the character live through it and experiencing it with the character. So I'm not going to get this sort of character depth through these stories, but I still kind of find it compelling just because of the raw emotion in it. And I guess in this one in particular, it's relatively different than what I've read before from her, just because it is more or less a retelling of a myth. And it's focusing, I think, a lot on human loneliness and what it means to be isolated and looking for companionship wherever you might find it. Good evening and Merry Christmas. It is the third night of Hanukkah and I am at my parents' house for the day, hence the changed location. And we lit our menorah together as a family earlier, so I'll just insert a picture up here. But I also have my book of short stories. I read a few more stories. I have another one to talk about tonight. I decided to focus on a Yiddish poet in Paris, which follows the character primarily of Sommer Gottlieb. He was a medical student who has a penchant for poetry. He moves from the Latin Quarter to Hotel Nacional, which brings him into contact with a lot of Eastern European immigrants and a lot of disease, I believe, and actually it ultimately makes him pretty sick. There's a sort of a foreshadowing element, because the whole reason he was a doctoral student was because, or a medical student was because his father died of consumption and his mother then pushed him to become a doctor. And meanwhile he's getting sicker, and this gives Lempel a chance to play with all of her florid imagery in the visions he's having and the types of poetry he's thinking about writing. And he has a sense of romanticism. And he's thinking about a girl, Henke, who lives in the hotel with him. He has a bit of a thing for her, and even writes to her mother about making her a mother-in-law that way. And he writes her a note when he's relatively sick, and then we move over to her perspective. And she has a flirtation going on with a Frenchman, but when she sees him so sick, she feels like she can't leave him. So there's just a tragedy to the story, but it's kind of moving. I mean, I guess the sickness makes it relatively moving, and the language is beautiful, lyrical, and it also is talking about a time and a place which, at least to my perspective now, I don't know when she wrote this in her life, but I was thinking about how it's about times long gone. It takes place in the mid-30s, so right before World War II and the Holocaust, although there's this tension throughout about refugees, particularly Eastern European Jewish refugees. There's also reference to like the Spanish Revolution and also famous Yiddish writers of the time, so it feels like a past world really, and one that even at the time maybe is a little bit fleeting, or maybe that's just because Gottlieb is dying, but it was sort of a eulogy and a nostalgic read. Maybe I like the first one better. Good evening. I'm back home again because I have to go back to work bright and early tomorrow morning. It is the fourth night of Hanukkah. I've read a couple more stories in this collection, and I think I'll talk about the last one, En route to divorce, which is a stream of consciousness story which takes place in the mind of Phyllis, who is on her way to Reno to get a divorce. That seems to be telling on Lempel's part. I don't know, because all I can think about is that it seems to be some sort of huge gamble. The divorce that Phyllis is partaking in is very much framed as by way of being a new thing, a women's lib sort of thing, where she's able to sort of assert herself and get away from marriage she's finding suffocating, and is something she wouldn't have been able to do in times before, basically. But otherwise, this whole women's lib movement doesn't seem to be working out for her. I don't know, there's references to a roommate who has too much sex and makes Phyllis very uncomfortable, or she goes to a party where she's assaulted by a woman who is very abusive with her. Meanwhile, she's on the plane and getting attracted to some men with attache cases and watching one of the flight attendants flirt with them and thinking about, wait, this is so transient, isn't it? Like, how would these people even have a relationship? So there seems to be some critique of the women's lib, as it were, and if there's anything lasting and meaningful in that. But the only good thing perhaps to come out of it is that she got this divorce, because it doesn't seem like there's anything good she has to say about her husband. But anyway, to me, I don't know, this story, I don't think it spoke to me as much. It's too stream of consciousness for me. There's just wasn't enough for me to latch onto, or maybe it's just the time and place that I read it myself, but I could see that she's probing all of these ideas of, is this modern take worth it, but I don't know, there just wasn't a lot by way of actual characters and events to latch onto. I don't know, as I grow older, I'm not sure if stream of consciousness is always working for me as much. But it does seem like Phyllis at the end of the day is still looking for something steady, and she's fantasizing about finding a new man and starting a new life, but at the meantime she's on her way to this divorce in the rocky, gambly area of Reno. So it wasn't about the Holocaust, so I figured it might give me something different to talk about here, but I don't think this one will be my fave. Good evening. It is the fifth night of Hanukkah. I think I was a little cranky last night. Hopefully I'm less so tonight, although the story that stuck out to me the most, again, returns to the Holocaust, this time right smack dab in the middle of it in occupied Paris. It's called Her Last Dance, and it's about a Jewish spy who is a lover to high-ranking Nazi officials. In fact, her Judaism doesn't actually mean a whole lot to her, and she's constantly described by how little she knows about the religion, and also her dyed blonde hair, just I guess to show that she is certainly not Aryan. But she's still a bit of a resistance fighter. She is a lover to both Nazi officials and also a French police chief who is in cahoots with them. But she's smuggling flyers and such to the resistance. But she's apparently not as good at her job as she thinks she is. She's a little sloppy on her game because she's at this formal function with dancing and such. And the highest-ranking Nazi official is getting annoyed with her and realizes that something is off with her behavior. And he casually goes to the phone and basically orders her death. And so it's about her final few hours, I guess, where she's kind of trying to get out of the relationship with the French chief because she feels like it's not going anywhere anymore. And then she's more or less escorted out against her will and, is killed. And it just, I think what sticks out to me the most is what Lempel, I think, is trying to say about, well, the banality of it, how casually violent it is, and how easy it is to just, for the Nazis just to kill somebody on a whim. And there's already a lot of stuff, background information in here from the woman's narrative about how, you know, she's downplaying all of the rumors of mass extermination, but everyone in France knows of people being lined up and shot by the Nazis. So, you know, this whole machine is just very casually violent. And I think she's also perhaps commenting on the fact that even though this woman, I think, tried to leave her Judaism behind, she wasn't a resistance fighter because of it, but even so, even in trying to save herself from that, she wasn't able to. At least that's sort of the feel I got from it. Mostly I think what sticks out to me is how she was able to personify that just casual violence of Nazi protocols. I do think it stuck with me more right after I read it. I read it a little earlier today. So it's a bit chilling, but I guess that's how it leaves its mark. Good evening. It is the 6th night of Hanukkah. It's also the start of Shabbat, or the end of this week. And I have a cat milling about near my precarious camera setup, so let's hope this all goes okay. I guess I should try to keep it snappy. So I return again to this collection of stories, this time to talk about the offering The Twin Sisters. And last night I talked about the Holocaust as it was happening, and tonight I return to the near future, where instead of dealing with directly with the atrocities of the Nazis, I'm dealing with the theme of revenge. These twin sisters were survivors of the Holocaust who lost their family and ended up moving to 2 different countries afterwards. One of them moved to England, and the other one, curiously enough, moved to Germany. And they meet basically in Italy in the middle every year, just to keep up with one another. Oh my! So yes, at least I'm keeping things fun and interesting with the non-bookish content. The fun part anyway. You know, these stories can be pretty bleak. I mean, in a way this one is the most satisfying because, you know, after so much atrocity about the Holocaust, this sister who moved to Germany is moving there for revenge, and Lempel goes through backstory about what happened to their family and then goes into what the sister does for revenge. And I don't know, the way I talk about things and recap them feels so clunky, but her writing style is so lyrical and is so in tune with the emotional realities of characters that I think she does better with eking out these themes in a way that is emotionally resonant. But again, these are not stories that are easy to recap, and they're not really all that interested in a traditional narrative of, you know, this happens, this happens, this happens sort of thing. And it's much more about her sort of doling out these feelings in almost a reporting style, except I think it has more artistry than that. It's been a difficult collection, you know, to talk about. I think it's maybe a little cranky even, I don't know. Also, you know, of course, so many of these stories are kind of bleak, but it's also kind of nice in a way to, you know, deal with the emotional resonances of what the Holocaust means. But occasionally she goes into other subjects. We have a couple more nights left of Hanukkah, so we'll see what happens in the very last few stories that I'll be reading tomorrow. Good evening. It is the 7th night of Hanukkah. My cat is sleepy, I hope, or at the very least she's not on the table near the camera, so this will be a less exciting installment, I believe. Perhaps especially because of the story I feel like I should review tonight, the final story in this collection called Pastorale which is very nostalgic in tone. It's very much about the end of life and looking more towards death and the afterlife than life itself. It's, again, rather rambling and emotional, and it just is mostly the first-person narrator pondering a bunch of things, starting perhaps more generally and thinking about differences in Jewish expression, and I'm assuming, since this is Lempel, that she's talking about like at the end of the 20th century, which was at the end of her life, and she's talking about how more people are becoming religious again and celebrating Shabbat again, and she has all the imagery of people going to synagogue, and she thought about how 30 years ago it was the opposite, and it was the old people going to synagogue and the young people staying home, and now it's like reversed itself. So that she looks at it and she only thinks of memories, actually, of her dead parents and that sort of thing. And then she goes into her relationship with her husband during the final steps of his life. In fact, speaking of superstition, she is knitting a sweater and unraveling it day by day, and it sort of signifies his life in her mind. And it also is tied in a bit with the fact that he has a growth growing in his brain, so it does seem like, his days are numbered. And finally, she visits people in the old folks' home, and I figure maybe I'll actually read a little bit to talk about this lyricism. And she says, recollects to herself, "Not so long ago, I reflect, these old people were like little children pressed tenderly to their mothers' bosoms. All too soon they were mothers and fathers themselves. Now they tremble like dry leaves on the bough, faces clouded, eyes dim, counting the hours from one meal to the next." Or if you really want to drive the point home, here is her thoughts on a man she is reading to from Isaac Bashevis Singer, so the lost Yiddish world of writing, I suppose. Although he keeps his past under lock and key, the number on his arm reveals his secret. Sometimes, when the spirit moves him, he sings selections from the Yiddish theater. He knows the names of all the dead actors. Those who are among the living, he dismisses with a wave of the hand. So yeah, I guess I appreciate why the translators and I assume curators of this collection put that one at the end of the collection. It definitely has a feeling of finality. This is the end of life. This is the last of what we will get and experience. And from here, there is one final thing in this collection, which technically is not a short story, but I will get to it tomorrow as I myself conclude the celebration of the holiday of Hanukkah. Good evening, and welcome to the 8th and final night of Hanukkah, where I am here to talk not about a short story in this collection, but the final thing that the translators Ellen Cassidy and Yirmiyahu Aharon Taub translated from Bloom Lempel's Yiddish, which is the fate of the Yiddish writer. And it has a little bit, I suppose, of a fatalist theme. She certainly, if writing this near the end of her life, was writing during a time period when Yiddish was becoming less popular. Or, I don't know, Yiddish is complicated. The ultra-Orthodox community often still speaks in Yiddish, and there's a Yiddish revivalist movement elsewhere. But in terms of the general Jewish community, yes, Yiddish has gone out of style, as it were. And a large part of that, as she talks about very lyrically in this essay, has to do with the Holocaust and so many Yiddish speakers, so much of European Jewry dying in the Holocaust. That being said, this is a very short essay, and she then sort of veers off into another direction that's a little more confusing about publishing and the difficulty she had in publishing, and she sort of attributes it to being a Yiddish writer and having to pay exorbitant fees, and I'm just kind of confused by how it all works. It seems like she's mostly trying to publish in Israel even, and maybe the publishing world is different there, but I don't know, the way she talked about it made me think of vanity presses or something, and not the usual way that people can publish here or self-publish here in America. But yeah, it was an interesting way, I suppose, to go out, hearing her talk most directly about her own life and maybe confirm some things that I thought about the stories and their autobiographical nature and how she thought of her brother who died in the Holocaust as she was writing a lot of them. It's been a strange and sort of sad Hanukkah out there in the wider world, even or especially as late as events that happened last night on the seventh night, which perhaps makes me a little more open to the idea of dwelling on the Holocaust and all of the a lot of the fiction in this book and a lot of what I talked about this video. Suddenly it all kind of comes back to that theme. But I'm happy to be standing here with new candles, which hopefully are lit properly, and sharing the light in the darkness. Hanukkah is about showcasing a miracle, about showcasing that Jews were able to overcome horrible adversity in the past, and that, you know, that story means something, it matters, it's something we should remember and should stick with us, certainly as history can repeat itself in certain ways. So yeah, I guess that's how I will end my Hanukkah 2019/5780. I will also include a link to the Goodreads book review I did for this book down below. I hope that everyone celebrating Hanukkah had a meaningful one, and I hope everyone is gearing up nicely for the end of the secular year. Chag Sameach, everyone. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.